During the early days of the United States, voting was restricted.
Only white males in most parts of the country were able to vote. 75 to 80% of the electorate voted regularly in presidential elections and even in congressional elections.
Just after the Civil War, 2 amendments were added to the Constitution. Amendments that gave citizenship to blacks and guaranteed males the right to vote regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Many southern states retaliated with laws that made it difficult, if not impossible, for new voters to exercise their right.
The act that really brought large numbers of blacks into the political process was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And we're talking almost 100 years after the ratification of the 15th Amendment.
Prior to the Voting Rights Act, the local county officials would ask blacks, but not whites, how many bubbles are there in a bar of soap as part of a so-called literacy test.
Mrs. Harris, how long have you lived in Selma?
I've lived here about 12 years.
And how many times have you tried to register to vote?
Approximately 7 or 8 times.
And what has happened on those attempts to register?
In the recent years, I received letters that I failed to answer one or more of the pertinent questions.
And then even blacks who had gone to college, some with graduate degrees, were determined illiterate based on the questions and the answers that the registrars received.
Well, how much education do you have? How far have you gone in school?
I received my Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Louisville in Louisville, Kentucky, Master of Science degree from Alabama A&M College in Normal, Alabama, in the field of sociology, and my master's in secondary education and political science.
So from the late 1860s, early 1870s, through 1965, you have large numbers of blacks who are voting in kind of northern areas or areas where, in fact, there were no overt restrictions to their voting, and smaller numbers in the South, but that was because, in fact, they were prohibited from voting through poll taxes and literacy tests.
One of the coveted souvenirs.
When the law was passed and finally signed by Johnson in August of 1965, there were only a handful of black people who were registered to vote in Dallas County, which is the county where Selma is located. And then within the next 3 or 4 months, 15,000 blacks were registered to vote because federal examiners were actually sent down to the South and were empowered to register people.
When the 15th Amendment gave black males the right to vote, at least on paper, women had hopes of getting the vote as well.
Women's suffrage was coupled in the 1840s to the abolition movement. And many women thought at the end of the Civil War, we're going to get the right to vote. And it didn't come for another 50 years or so. So when you think political reform, fixing a political system, getting an electoral process to work properly in a way that really serves the public, that often takes a long period of time.
The idea of lowering the national voting age from 21 to 18 was first introduced in the 1950s. In the aftermath of the Vietnam conflict, Congress took the steps necessary to make it happen, expanding further the list of eligible voters.